Today on The State of Us, Russia is digging in and China is stepping up. How should the U.S. respond? Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by the one and only Lance Jackson, your friendly redneck liberal and senior resident historian here at True Chat. Today, we're taking a look at the many updates in regards to the Russian and Ukrainian war, what Russia has been doing, how things are changing on the home front for Russia, Russia's recent attack on a residential area in Ukraine that killed at least 21 people, including some children. We're also going to discuss the U.S.'s increase in our presence in NATO countries as a response to this, and look at what's happening in China right now, how President Xi Jinping is signaling confidence during his Hong Kong trip and over their economy, trying to maintain that message that they will, in fact, still best the United States this year in growth. So we've got a lot to talk about, and we'll wrap it up with how the U.S. should respond to these things. But Lance, do we have a word of the day?
We do. The word of the day is menacious. 3 syllables. It's an adjective. M-I-N-A-C-I-O-U-S. Menacious. It means menacing or threatening. And unfortunately, the news on the foreign front isn't much better than on the home front. But I think it's time that we take a look at what's going on with China and Russia and how it is affecting and might affect the United States. I know most of us are coming off of a holiday weekend, and we've had all these Supreme Court decisions recently. We've had the January 6th hearings. We've had more mass shootings, even at a holiday parade. And I wish I could say, well, we're going to turn to foreign affairs and tell you some good things that are going on, but I'm not sure they're good, but I think we do have to know about them. So let's talk about what's going on with China and then Russia and how it will impact us, because we all have to make decisions for the upcoming winter months.
So let's take a look, Lance. What's happening with NATO right now, right? The U.S. is getting ready to commit more troops as a result of everything going on. We've got Finland and Sweden that are going to become members of NATO, which is kind of the opposite of what Putin wanted, right? I mean, his whole thing was, let's stop NATO from, or at least that's what he was saying. We don't want NATO to expand, and here NATO's about to add 2 new countries. It looks like that is poised to happen for sure. So that's not ideal, but the U.S. is upping its troop deployments, correct, to Europe.
It's not ideal for whom? I think is it ideal for the United States and the rest of the world that they're going to grow NATO as, in the face of what Vladimir Putin said, I'm going to invade the Ukraine because I don't want Ukraine to become part of NATO. So I think it's a good thing when you look at it for the United States, but obviously Putin is how's he going to react to this, right? And the fact that I don't think Putin would want the troops, permanent troops in Poland and in Italy and the different places. And also now the Turkish president got a meeting with Biden after this NATO meeting, and because Turkey's not going to stand in the way of Sweden and Finland coming in. So it would appear that Putin has support for the war in his home country, but he seems to be losing the battle as far as support in Europe for what he's trying to do. Which how will that play out? I don't know.
Well, I think part of that, a couple things that play into it, right, is we have some new polling, which we want to talk about. How are people in Russia feeling? How are people in Ukraine feeling about what's going on? And how does that impact what the rest of the world is doing in response? A number of political analysts have suggested that residents of Moscow and St. Petersburg, which drew the largest of the early anti-war protests, are pretty removed from the war because the army tends to attract recruits from the poorer regions, according to some independent data. So that
you know what that reminds me of? When you read that, in my mind, I thought Vietnam. Because early in the Vietnam conflict, most Americans didn't know where Vietnam was. It didn't affect their lifestyle. They didn't care because the majority of U.S. troops being sent to Vietnam were from minority families and poor families, because those were the draft laws were such that if you were in college, which, in the 60s, most people didn't go to college, and it was only mostly wealthy people who went to college, not all, but mostly. So the war is being fought by the poor. And when you said that, in Russia, it's like life goes on in the big city because they're not being affected. They're not under attack. Their children aren't going off to war. Their boyfriends, their husbands aren't going off to war. And so it's like out of sight, out of mind. Just very similar to me as my age, thinking of how the United States reacted in the Vietnam conflict early on.
Yeah, there's an expert on Russia politics at King's College in London who basically explains that the way President Vladimir Putin's authoritarian regime has sought to develop a social contract where people focus on bettering their own lives while leaving politics to the state. And I think that is a telling, what you're describing, Lance, right, is this notion that it's out of sight, out of mind. And you might be like, well, how is that possible? Because Russia's economy is hurting. But again, that contract's been in place. Most of the people that are alive today are used to that contract with their Russian state. So, they may express some disapproval here or there, but they understand that the way that their society functions is mostly let the politicians be politicians and let us do our stuff and work on our lives.
Well, if I have a place to live and I have some food and I have fuel for my vehicle, well, I'm happy. I'm satisfied. And, it wasn't that long ago when Russia was experimenting with capitalism that food lines developed, gas shortages, people didn't have basic necessities, which allowed for Putin to come back into power because he said, well, remember, you maybe didn't have everything you wanted, but the government took, under communism, but we took care of your basic necessities. And when you looked at your neighbors, they didn't have any more than you did. So, is your life really better under capitalism, or do you come back to communism, which is what you're describing, right? We'll run things for you and we'll provide the basic necessities for life. So, hey, you're happy. And I don't say that as like, well, the Russians are less. I think most Americans are that way, right? We don't pay attention to something until it starts to affect us.
So let's talk about how things are going for Ukraine. There's been some progress, some setbacks. One of the things that's recently changed is Ukraine has access now to U.S.-guided rockets, specifically the High Mobility Artillery Rocket System. And this has already started to make a difference. Just recently, a Ukrainian unit under the cover of darkness drove the truck-mounted rocket launcher into position, punched in coordinates, and pressed the launch button. 6 200-pound rockets slammed into the Russian position, largely destroying it. The Russian base was one of about 10 high-value positions, says a lieutenant in Ukraine's military, that was hit in the last 2 weeks since taking charge of the systems, the most sophisticated weaponry Washington has supplied to Ukraine since Russia invaded February 24th. Ukrainian soldiers operating the system say they have doubled their reach into Russian-held territory with greater precision and less risk to themselves. Question, though, Lance, is what are the Ukrainian people feeling about the conflict? What does this recent, because there's some new poll data, how are they feeling about what's going on?
Well, 89% say it would be unacceptable to reach a peace deal with Moscow by ceding Ukrainian territory that Russian forces have seized in their invasion this year. 81% say it would be unacceptable to cede any occupied territory from Russia before February 24th, 89% after February 24th.
So 8 in 10 Ukrainians want their country back.
Right.
They're not interested in a peace deal that involves anything less than the full return of Ukraine to Ukraine.
But in transparency, it was 1,000 people basically were polled, and it was people who are in the territories where Ukraine is still in control of its country.
Right.
So it's not any of the, nobody took part in the survey in the regions that are currently controlled by Russia. I think other things that are important here is that about 3/4 of Ukrainians are satisfied with support from the United States and the UK, whereas only about 25% of Ukrainians are satisfied with French and German help.
So one thing the U.S. could do is pressure our allies, Germany and France in particular, to step up what they're doing to help Ukraine.
And that's what I was leading to. Not only is the United States providing this high-powered missile system, but other NATO countries have agreed to help support that as well. And I think that's where the United States can use some of its power. What was interesting is it takes less than 3 minutes once this station is set up to punch in the coordinates and launch the missiles. And then 20 seconds, less than a minute after the missiles have been fired, the system can move. So it makes it hard for the enemy to retaliate because it's tough to get coordinates, because once they fire their missiles, it's allowed to
drive
move.
away.
You drive away, so it's trying to hit a moving target, which it's interesting because remember a couple of months ago when we started talking about this, we said, what would happen if the U.S. started to give more weapons and supplies? What would the Russian response be? Because the United States is still sending short-range missiles. They won't send anything that the Ukrainians could send into Russia. So it's only being sent to places to drive the Russians out. But what happens if they start to gain ground, right? And can shoot into Russia? And again, we've taken that step, right? We've provided more than we said we would at the beginning. What's going to be the response of the Russians?
And technically, Ukraine's membership into NATO is still under consideration officially.
Right. Even though NATO's growing, Ukraine is not one of the countries that's being accepted.
Not yet, anyway.
Right.
There's that whole question of what that might look like, which we've talked about before. 97% of Ukrainians support the military currently, or have confidence in the military, 84% in President Vladimir Zelensky. So, and
about the same number in Russia for Putin.
Correct.
So if that remains the same, that remains the same, probably not going to see a lot of movement, right? Because neither side is upset with their leadership and what they're doing. So
you're going to continue to see Putin's menacious attitude, because why would it change if the people aren't strongly opposed? Likewise, you're going to continue to see a lot of confidence from Ukraine on saying, look, we got some new weapons, right? And we want our country back.
So Putin is menacious and the Ukrainians are confident.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Says the good friends of Ukraine. All right, let's take a look at what's happening with China. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. President Xi Jinping in China has marked the 25th anniversary of the handover of Hong Kong, saying the city has left chaos behind. We're done, Lance. There's no more chaos. It's over. We've done it. Now that we've freed you from the evil grasps of Britain, everything is perfect, exactly the way you want it. No more chaos.
And we in China passed some menacious laws on Hong Kong and said, if you protest or do this or do that, you'll be thrown away, you'll be thrown in jail, and the key will be thrown away.
But they've secured democracy.
But that's in the eyes of the Chinese leadership, that is democracy in the making for Hong Kong. So see, there's no more protests. There's no more riots. Nobody throwing Molotov cocktails at police officers. So we now have freedom and democracy in Hong Kong. And should you not agree with that, then we will have to pass some more menacious measures to make sure that you enjoy your democracy.
The city has enjoyed true democracy since the handover, President Xi said, adding that the electoral system had been improved to ensure that officials are patriotic to China.
Well, wait, nice prepositional phrase there, right? To China. They're patriotic to China.
That's right.
Not to Hong Kong.
No.
Not to the rest of the world, but they're patriotic to
and
China.
And that's democracy, baby.
So we have democracy in full bloom in Hong Kong.
Got it. There were no public protests at this year's event. Security closed off streets and footbridges near event venues and temporarily banned the flying of drones in the city. Police warned small opposition and civil groups to keep a low profile with none of the July 1st civil rights marches that had for years been a feature of Hong Kong life.
And Hong Kong's such a great place that President Xi actually spent 12 hours over his 2.5-day visit in Hong Kong. Not the evenings, though. He flew back to mainland to be, to protect himself, but then would come back the next day and visit with officials. So he really is a strong believer in this freedom and democracy that's existing because he didn't even spend the night in Hong Kong during his visit.
Nowadays, without protest and as fewer people are willing to speak out on sensitive political subjects, it has become harder to gauge public opinion in Hong Kong, according to the Wall Street Journal. Since the security law was introduced, tens of thousands of residents have left the city, while others grew apathetic over politics.
So since they didn't like what was going, they left or got thrown in jail. So therefore, democracy reigns. Because the troublemakers are gone. See, it's all you got to do. Get rid of the troublemakers and you can have democracy.
China's menacious attitude has driven tens of thousands of people that didn't like the way things were going in Hong Kong out. And so now democracy prevails. I'm obviously, folks, hopefully the sarcasm there is taken, that clearly this is not, I don't think, what most of us think of when we think of democracy, is not simply just running out the people that have things to say that you don't like. And obviously, in the case of Hong Kong, which we've been covering for a while, China has been trying to, grip harder Hong Kong and sort of squeeze and crack down on the somewhat independent nature of Hong Kong. And I think, especially in recent years, we've seen that become less and less and less. And the rights that many Hong Kong citizens did have definitely eroded as a result over the past 4 or 5 years.
Well, and this is also a political ploy, right? Because the Chinese president is asking for 5 more years of leadership. So, this is a good PR move back to China saying, look what I've done. When I took over, a few years ago, there was all this trouble in Hong Kong. And now since I've been in control, oh, wait a minute, things are tough in China right now at home. So what do we see the leadership do in China? Take a trip to foreign countries or to, why is it really foreign, right, with Hong Kong? But we'll take a trip to Hong Kong, and that diverts the fact that we have a zero COVID policy and that our economy is not growing as well as it was, to the point that U.S. President Biden has the audacity to say that the U.S. economic growth might be better than China this year, which is something that hasn't happened in decades. Oh my gosh. I mean, that doesn't sound like the kind of news that I want to get out if I am running for 5 more years of being the leader of China.
So for those that don't know, it is kind of confusing, and there are people that obviously spend their life learning and becoming experts on this. But the People's Republic of China is a hierarchical electoral system. And what does that mean? Well, basically, it means there are small divisions of government that elect the higher divisions of government. So the local people's congresses, okay, which could be, think of this from a United States standpoint, like all the way down to a county level, okay, Those people are directly elected by the citizens of China that are part of mainland China. Okay. And then they select the next highest, like you get to state government. They elect those people. And then those people at the state government elect the people at the national government. And then the people at the national government elect the president. So just so that everybody understands, very different than in the United States where you, me, Lance, we vote on who the president is, right? If we want to. They do not do that in China, right? In fact, for most people,
they don't even vote for who their governor is or who their mayor is.
Right. Now, that's not to say that a, hierarchical electoral system is necessarily terrible. There's different, obviously, political theory on that.
Well, but
understanding that it's very different than how we do things. To say that he's going for another term does not mean that he needs the people of China's support.
He's not trying to impress the billions of voters in China.
No.
He has a very small group who are the national leaders of China who he's trying to impress and make sure that he has them under wraps.
Yes.
Is what you're trying to say.
Exactly.
Which is not mendacious at all.
He needs the support of half of 2,981 people. That's what he needs to be president for another 5 years.
So you get to feel the room and you do a few things that will make more than half of them happy. You get 1,500 votes and you get to stay the leader of China.
Yes.
Interesting to know that.
That's right. I mean, I think it's just helpful, not to go into world
because
civics here, but
when we think of different places, we put our knowledge to work and think, oh, well, this is the way we do it. That's the way everybody else must do it. And so it's good to know that basically you have 3,000 people that are picking the new leader of China for the next 5 years.
Because elections in China occur under a single-party authoritarian political system. Elections occur only at the local level, not the national level, and China is among a few contemporary party-led dictatorships to not hold any direct elections at the national level. The competitive nature of the elections is highly constrained by the Chinese Communist Party's monopoly on power in China, which then gives them, the way that China's government is set up, gives them the ability to basically determine how all that government stuff is going to work.
Does the Communist Party like what you're doing, or do they have a new favorite son that they want to put in power?
Right. I think the important thing to think about is, structurally speaking, right, China is a type of republic. However, we refer to it as a communist nation because the controlling political party with a supermajority is the Communist Party, who pushes that ideology and uses a republic form of government to be authoritarian, which goes back to that whole notion of you can structure your government to be a republic. It doesn't mean that you have a republic. So
just like you can call it a democracy, but it doesn't mean it is a democracy.
It doesn't mean that it is.
You're free to do whatever we tell you.
Right.
You have to do.
That's right.
And if you don't, we'll throw you in jail.
You can do these things, but as long as they don't interfere with these things. That's right.
Because those are mendacious to us, and I want to stay in power. So you can't do those mendacious things towards us. So therefore, if you do these things that we approve of, then you are free.
The Wall Street Journal also reported, Lance, on the U.S. and China vying to pull ahead on growth. They're both practicing a mendacious attitude as the superpower rivalry puts more emphasis on economic strength. The goals for both are optimistic. According to the Wall Street Journal, over the past month, President Biden twice publicly stated that the U.S. economy might grow faster this year than China's for the first time since 1976. The statements, the White House said, were based on independent projections. They have struck a nerve in Beijing, according to policy advisors and Chinese economists who consult with the government. In China, the annual growth figure has always been the most watched economic data point, unlike the U.S., where inflation and jobless numbers get more attention. And for decades, it was no contest at all, with China's posting double-digit growth for several decades. Now, China's target is the lowest in more than 3 decades, but economists still see it as out of reach as long as Mr. Xi sticks with his zero-tolerance approach to COVID-19. So this is kind of interesting because it's been a long time since the U.S. has actually had an opportunity to pull ahead of China on growth.
I would agree. And it gives, President Biden a good talking point, and it chips away a little bit at the thought of Chinese economic power in the world.
Interesting, too, how we use different measures, isn't it? In the U.S. and in China, the things that we focus on,
Well, we're going to focus on, right? I mean, this is political. We're going to focus on what makes us look good. So obviously the United States is not going to focus on that number because our growth numbers are never going to reach that. But we say, well, it can't because we don't control the economy the way the Chinese do. They control, the pay and production and work hours and all of those things. The government controls that, not private independent business people. So it's kind of like comparing, two totally different systems. So yeah, but why refer to a number that you're going to constantly lose? Say, no, we don't think that's an important number. What's important to us is, inflation and job growth or unemployment or, whatever numbers we want to look at.
So let's talk about what should the U.S. do about Ukraine.
Got a lot of ideas about what we should do.
China. Let's find out what those ideas are. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. There's a lot happening around the world, certainly plenty happening here in the United States as well, but it's important to keep that perspective and remember that we are not alone and things are happening that affect us around the world and affect what we should stand for, right? What are we about? What are we doing? I think it's no secret that Lance and I are not necessarily thrilled with the approach the United States has had with Ukraine. I think we can do a better job on China. I think we've also, though, been saying that for several years on more than one front. So we've been talking about Hong Kong now for, 4 or 5 years, right? I mean, ever since this crackdown started, we've been trying to tell people, hey, this is a problem.
And it doesn't matter whether it's been a Republican leadership or a Democratic leadership.
It's spanned that time frame.
We've kind of we feel here on the show that the U.S. government, no matter who the leadership is, has kind of stepped lightly when it comes to Hong Kong and allowed the Chinese to slowly grasp power and over the region. And I think we both kind of feel the same way with Ukraine. That's why it was interesting to read the article because, the headlines are that the Russians are starting to bomb again, that they're making their way toward Kiev or Kyiv. And so to hear that the U.S. is giving these missiles to the Ukrainians that will help them counter this and that more are on the way and that NATO is growing. And I think this throws the ball back into Putin's court. How's he going to respond to this? And let's not forget, we have a very important midterm election coming up here in the United States as well. Not that politics would ever play a role in any leadership's decision making.
No, not
at all. Be
it
Democrat or Republican.
Not at all.
Not casting aspersions at a political party. But if you are an early watcher, I don't know if you call the 1st of July for a November midterm election early, but if you are watching the bantering and the positions being taken by different people as we enter the primary season here in the middle of it or towards the end of it, it's amazing the stances that are being taken. And I wonder, how this is all going to play out, because why aren't Germany and France supporting the way the Ukrainians want and the United States wants? Well, they want Russian oil. So what's the United States going to have to offer France and Germany to get the French and the Germans on the side of the United States and the Ukrainian people? Are we going to have to offer them some oil to make up for oil that we don't want them to buy from Russia? And if we do that, what does that do to heating oil prices here in the United States this winter. And how does that affect the election in November? I mean, there's a real balancing act going on here. The government not trying to do things to send the U.S. into a recession if we're not in one already, but yet still support and show our power overseas. This is why this doesn't get a lot of headlines and people don't want to necessarily talk about this and get into it. But this is, to me, why it's interesting. How are these world issues going to play and play out? And then what our government decides to do not only affects us here at home, but it's going to affect us on the world stage, which in 6 months to a year could affect us at home as well. That's why this stuff is important in my mind.
So the question is, what do we do moving forward on Ukraine? Because I agree. I think it's important. It's important long range. It's also important in the near term, but not maybe as in many ways as people realize the trickle effects of what's happening worldwide. But I mean, if you're concerned about inflation or supply chain problems or the price of gas, why is all that stuff happening? China and Russia. I mean,
very simple, right?
It's simple in that regard. It's very complicated how those two countries have affected all this. I mean, the process of how it's been affected, but our relations with them are having those effects on us, and so I think that's critical to understand. As far as Ukraine goes, and I don't know if Lance has changed his view, but my view is mostly unchanged in that I think now with Finland and Sweden being accepted into NATO, I think you need to finish that. I think you need to bolster what's being provided to Ukraine right now. And I think NATO needs to make clear to Ukraine the reason, just so folks understand, there's a number of different reasons that Ukraine hasn't been admitted into NATO yet, right? Despite having taken their vote and wanting to be in NATO. One of them is the obvious political concern, right, of Ukraine and how Russia is particularly sensitive to Ukraine being admitted to NATO and all that. That one we're all aware of. The other one is that, and this one's not talked about as much, that poll that we looked at, Lance, right, tells us that only something like, I think it's like 38% of Ukrainians have confidence in their Congress. Okay. And why is that? And what does that, and that's in a time of war, right? I mean, this is not even, we're not talking about peacetime here. We're talking about a time when you would think you'd be unified. And the reason I think that's notable is because it speaks to one of the reasons they haven't been admitted yet, which is the corruption inside of Ukraine. And I know everybody, it's like, how could you say that, yes, they're defending against Russia. Yes, it's terrible Russia's invaded. No, the people of Ukraine don't deserve that. They have problems with corruption, particularly in their Congress. And one of the reasons that NATO has resisted admitting them is because they have certain standards that they believe the democracies that participate as part of NATO should adhere to. Now, there's also members like Turkey who are part of NATO, and not to bash on Turkey by any means, but not every NATO member is perfect in that regard. So I think there's room there, but I guess what I'd like to see, Lance, is I'd like to see NATO release and say to Ukraine, once you have done X, Y, Z, we will grant you membership. Once we feel like you've met these benchmarks that we would ask, Sweden and Finland to meet as well, then we should let you in. And then you would be entitled, just like any other NATO member, to that acceptance. Now, how do we get there? That's more complicated.
Well, I think the key is the United States needs to continue to show a more tenacious attitude, that we need to continue to send missiles. We need to continue to put troops in these NATO countries and say we're going to put them in there permanently. We need to put the pressure up on Russia and show our support for Ukraine. And in turn, there's an extra benefit here. It also shows the Chinese that we're not afraid to use what we have. And maybe it holds them in check. Maybe it stops them from doing one more thing, or maybe it backs the Chinese off of their support for Russia. Oh my gosh, the United States isn't playing around. It doesn't mean we're doing anything. It means, we have that attitude where like, you know what? we're blowing our back up here and saying, you guys going to get this right, or are we going to have to do something about it? See, that's different than actually having to do something. Now, you know how I feel. You don't do that unless you're willing to follow through. It can't be an idle threat, okay? But I think that's the key, because let's face it, it doesn't benefit the Chinese economically to get the United States involved in a war, right? The economies of countries can't grow the way the Chinese want to if everybody's at odds. So I think the U.S. threatening Russia a little bit more might also put the Chinese in check for a little bit more. My opinion. We'll see how it plays out.
And as far as China goes, I think what we haven't done, and I understand the possibility, of angering China and all that, but I think we, along with our allies, and we need to do a better job of pushing our allies, need to do, part of what we tried to do early with Ukraine and have continued to try to do, which is make sure people know what's happening. We don't speak out strongly and share our intelligence and tell people what's going on. And I think that's part of the problem is the world, for the most part, goes on its way and doesn't know what's happening in Hong Kong. We've tried to raise the alarm bell a little bit more on Taiwan, but I think we could do more in both of those cases. And none of those are military things. It's just really calling them out on the world stage, because China hates to be embarrassed. They don't like that. So you do that and you say, hey, look, we don't have to keep doing that, but then we want to see some things change, and if they don't change, then you keep calling them out. And I know some of those things sound like they should be simple, but obviously we're not doing them. And I'm sure there's people out there that would say those are bad ideas, in which case you should send us an email, podcast@thestateofus.org, and let us know what you think. Why do we have this conversation today, Lance? Is it because we're just trying to be mendacious? Is that
no?
Is that no?
And that one doesn't count.
That doesn't count?
No. As we go into the closing, those don't
you don't
count.
think so?
I don't think Bradley counts those.
Okay, I thought it was once you started speaking, it doesn't count.
No.
Okay.
Not once you throw it to me there. Well, we do this because you and I have an interest, right? And we try to encourage our listeners to have an interest in foreign affairs, especially the stuff that you find in the middle pages of the newspaper or on the back report of the newscast, not the opening stories. But we do that because we have the mission here at True Chat, and that is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. Hopefully we've done that. We'll start a conversation in your home and in your office. And when people say, well, I haven't read this stuff, where are you finding this out? You can tell them about the show and then tell them that they can listen so they can partake in the conversation with us. And they can find us as a podcast on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is heard Tuesday and Thursday mornings as a podcast. We're released first thing in the mornings and, of course, on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations across the country. What do you have today for our victor, Lance?
Well, you scored early on my starter, but I made a great comeback against your bullpen, but I have you with a 6-5 win.
Oh.
Your closer came in and shut the door on me as I was coming back. But
Tremendous. For the State of Us, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to producer Bradley Butch. Thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.